A bank worker, a young man obsessed with The Thomas Crown Affair, a film about a millionaire who robs a bank just for fun. Watching, he wonders, what if I could do it myself? One day, after finishing his shift, he picks up a bag. Inside, $215,000 in cash. No masks, no alarms, no one stopping him. He walks out the front door, and just like that, he's gone. This is the real story of Ted Conrad. How did he steal a fortune and remain undiscovered until the very end of his life? Ted Conrad was 20 years old, working a regular job as a bank teller at Society National Bank in Cleveland, Ohio. He wasn't some hardened criminal. He wasn't reckless. If anything, he was ordinary. He showed up to work on time, smiled at customers, made conversation with his co-workers. Polite, reliable, trustworthy, the kind of person you wouldn't look twice at. But behind that easygoing charm, there was something else. Ted wasn't like his co-workers who went to work just to collect a paycheck. He was restless, bored. There was a part of him that wanted something bigger. Then came The Thomas Crown Affair, a movie about a wealthy, brilliant man who robs a bank. Not because he needs the money, but because he wants to prove that he can. Ted saw that movie, and then he saw it again, and again. And the more he watched, the more the idea started turning in his head. What if I could do it? At first, it was just talk. He joked with his friends that robbing a bank wasn't as difficult as people thought, that security wasn't as tight as it seemed, that if someone planned it right, they could just walk in, take the money, and walk out. People laughed it off. No one took him seriously. But Ted wasn't joking. He started paying attention, watching how cash was moved, who was counting it, where it was kept, and more importantly, who wasn't watching. To him, this wasn't just about stealing money. It was a test to see if he could outsmart the system, a test to see if he could pull off something so simple, so clean, that no one would even realize what happened until it was too late. And on Friday, July 11th, 1969, that's exactly what he did. Ted Conrad didn't just wake up one morning and decide today was the day. He had been waiting for the right moment, watching, studying. The bank's routine never changed. People got comfortable. No one expected anything unusual, and most importantly, no one expected him. So he picked his moment carefully. Friday. Why Friday? Because Fridays were busy. The bank was handling more cash than usual, preparing for weekend withdrawals. Employees were distracted, thinking about their plans. No one was hyper-focused on security. And more importantly, no one would check the cash reserves until Monday morning. That gave him a 48-hour head start. He came in that morning like always, same routine, same smile. He counted stacks of bills, made small talk, laughed at bad jokes from customers. Everything normal. But this wasn't a normal day. Ted had already made up his mind. By the time the bank doors locked for the night, he would be gone. And no one would even realize what had happened until it was too late. Ted Conrad didn't need a gun, didn't need a mask, didn't need to sneak around like a man about to commit a crime. Because at Society National Bank, security wasn't just weak, it was almost non-existent. There were no armed guards watching over the cash, no cameras recording transactions, no security alarms tracking money movement. And the biggest flaw? No one expected an inside job. As a bank teller, Ted had full access to the cash vaults. He handled thousands of dollars daily, and no one questioned it. There were no strict protocols, no double checks, no end-of-day balancing. As long as the numbers seemed close enough at the end of the week, no one took a second look. Ted had seen it all firsthand. He knew exactly how the system worked, and more importantly, where it could be exploited. So on Friday, July 11th, 1969, he walked into work just like he had every other day. He clocked in, greeted his co-workers, handled stacks of bills, helped customers with withdrawals. To anyone watching, it was business as usual. But as the end of the day approached, Ted knew this was the moment. At closing time, as employees wrapped up their shifts and prepared for the weekend, Ted stayed behind for just a little longer. No rush, no hesitation. Just quiet, calculated movements. Instead of locking up the cash like he was supposed to, he grabbed a plain brown paper bag. Just a regular lunch bag, nothing out of the ordinary, and then he started filling it, stack after stack of $100 bills, neatly packed, methodical, $215,000 in total. Today, that would be worth over $1.7 million. No alarms went off. No one was watching. There was nothing to stop him. With the bag in hand, he walked toward the front door. Not sneaking, not running, just walking. Then he stepped outside, and just like that, he was gone. No one stopped him. No one even looked twice. By the time the bank realized the money was missing, on Monday morning, nearly 48 hours later, Ted Conrad was already vanishing into a new life. Ted Conrad didn't run. He didn't hide in some abandoned house, hoping no one would find him. He disappeared by design. This wasn't some desperate escape plan thrown together at the last second. Ted had been preparing for this for months. Before he ever walked out of Society National Bank with a bag full of cash, he had already created his new identity. A new name, a new backstory, everything he needed to start over. He understood how people got caught. He knew what not to do. No panicked trips to the airport, no reckless spending that would raise suspicion, no contacting family or friends. He erased himself completely. Ted had likely spent time studying how authorities track fugitives. He knew that the second he used a bank, a credit card, or even checked into a hotel under his real name, there would be a paper trail. So he did none of it. Ted only used cash. Every motel room, every meal, every bus ticket, it was all paid for in untraceable bills. No credit history, no bank accounts, no loans. Nothing that could connect Ted Conrad to the man he was becoming. And it worked. Back in Cleveland, police were scrambling. By the time they even realized Ted had stolen the money, he was already days ahead of them. No witnesses saw him flee. No cameras captured his escape. There was no note, no sign of struggle, just an empty desk and a missing bank teller. When the case finally reached the FBI, Ted Conrad was already gone. After slipping out of Cleveland, he resurfaced hundreds of miles away in Massachusetts. Not as a fugitive, not as a man on the run, but as Thomas Randall, a name that had never been in police records, a man with no past, no criminal history, nothing that set off alarms. And he played it smart. He didn't try to live big or burn through the stolen cash recklessly. He kept a low profile, taking jobs that required no background checks, no paperwork. His first move? Country clubs and golf courses. Rich people didn't ask too many questions about a golf pro. If you could teach a good swing, that's all that mattered. And Ted? He could charm just about anyone. Over time, he became respected in the golf community, blending effortlessly into the wealthy suburban scene. But golf wasn't enough. He needed something stable, something long-term. So he moved into car sales. Not just any car sales, luxury dealerships, the kind of places where cash flowed and the right personality could sell a car without ever being questioned about where they came from. For decades, he lived like any other guy, a man who worked hard, made friends, and never raised suspicion. Then, in 1982, he got married, settled down, had a daughter, built a life. To everyone who met him, Thomas Randall was a good man, a devoted husband, a loving father, a guy who played golf on weekends and talked cars with his friends. No one questioned him, because no one suspected that for the past 50 years, they had been standing next to one of America's most wanted fugitives. And how does it look in Cleveland? At first, the Cleveland police handled the case. A missing bank teller, a stolen fortune, no forced entry, no weapons, no threats. It didn't look like a major crime, just a teller who never came back to work. But as the weekend passed and the missing cash was discovered, it became clear. This wasn't a mistake. This was a heist. And not just any heist. By Monday morning, Ted Conrad had been gone for nearly 48 hours. He had taken the equivalent of $1.7 million in today's money and disappeared without leaving a single clue. This was too big for local police. The case was turned over to the FBI, and Ted Conrad was officially a federal fugitive. The FBI thought this would be an easy case. A 20-year-old kid with no history of crime. He wasn't a professional, He didn't have connections. He was out there alone. How far could he have gone? They expected to catch him within weeks. They started by tracking the obvious leads, his family, his friends, his old classmates. But Ted never contacted any of them. They checked airports, train stations, and bus routes. Nothing. No one matching his description had bought a ticket. No one had seen him leave the city. It didn't make sense. He should have left a trail, but he didn't. With no immediate leads, the FBI expanded the search. The FBI assumed he had to be somewhere. They followed hundreds of tips from people claiming they had seen him. Reports placed him in Hawaii, Washington, D.C., even parts of Europe. Every time they sent agents to investigate, every time it led nowhere. The FBI had handled bank robberies before, but this case was different. Ted Conrad wasn't an armed criminal. He wasn't committing more crimes or making himself a bigger target. He had taken the money, disappeared, and never looked back. And that made finding him nearly impossible. In 1969, law enforcement didn't have the tools they have today. There were no nationwide databases connecting driver's licenses, no centralized system for tracking identities. If someone moved to a new state and applied for new documents, it was as if they had never existed anywhere else. There were no security cameras in train stations, no surveillance watching every street corner. If you traveled, no one was recording it. And there was no digital banking, no credit cards or electronic transactions that could be traced. A person could live completely off the radar if they had enough cash. Ted understood all of this. He knew how criminals got caught, and he avoided every mistake. He never used a credit card, never opened a bank account, never applied for anything that could connect his new life to the one he left behind. While other fugitives eventually slipped up, reaching out to family or falling back into crime, Ted disappeared so seamlessly that even the FBI had nothing to go on. Agents followed every possible lead. They checked airports, train stations, and bus routes, searching for any sign of him. People claimed to have seen him in Hawaii, Washington, D.C., even parts of Europe. But every tip led to nothing. There were no fingerprints, no confirmed sightings, no financial transactions to track. The years passed, then decades. The original agents working the case retired, and new investigators took over. But the result was always the same. By the time the 1990s arrived, the case was so cold that it was barely a priority anymore. For the FBI, Ted Conrad wasn't just missing. It was as if he had never existed at all. For 50 years, Ted Conrad lived as if the heist had never happened. No arrests, no close calls, no suspicion. To his neighbors, he was just Tom Randall, a quiet, friendly guy who worked as a golf pro and a car salesman, a devoted husband, a loving father, a man who had spent decades building an honest life. No one ever questioned him. No one ever suspected that the man they knew had once stolen a fortune and disappeared. But in May 2021, everything changed. Ted, now Thomas Randall, was dying of lung cancer. He was in his final days, and the weight of his secret had finally caught up to him. Before he passed, he turned to his family and said the words that changed everything. "I am not who you think I am." His wife, his daughter, the people who had known him for decades, they had no idea what he meant. The man they had loved, the man they had spent their lives with, was a fugitive. A man who had stolen $215,000 from his own bank and had been hiding in plain sight for half a century. But why reveal it now? Because for 50 years he carried the secret alone. He had lived the perfect second life, but he could never undo the past. And now, facing the end, he couldn't take the lie to the grave. After his death, his family informed authorities. Investigators compared old records, fingerprints, and personal details. And in 2021, after 5 decades of searching, the FBI finally had their answer. Ted Conrad, the man who had pulled off one of the most effortless bank heists in history, was officially unmasked as Thomas Randall. In one sense, Ted Conrad pulled off the perfect crime. He stole a fortune, disappeared, created a completely new identity, lived free for 50 years without ever getting caught. No prison time, no manhunt closing in, no late-night knocks at the door. By all accounts, he got away with it, but in the end, he couldn't escape himself. For 5 decades, he kept his secret buried, never telling a soul, never slipping up. But as death approached, he chose to confess. Not because he had to, not because he was caught, but because he couldn't take the lie any further. So did he win? Maybe. But the fact that he had to carry the truth alone for 50 years, never looking back, never reaching out, never breaking character, suggests that maybe he never truly escaped at all.